Hello everybody, welcome back to Exponential Finance, the podcast covering finance, technology and innovation, from our home in Japan and beyond. This episode is a recording of our premiere on LinkedIn Audio, where we exchange our impressions from the Singapore FinTech Festival held the week prior. We get to discuss the state of payments and crypto, and the coming convergence of these sectors, central bank digital currencies, the emerging opportunity for credit and lending, the surprising lack of AI during the festival, the hype of ESG, some aspects of digital banking, and last but not least, the regional rivalry between Hong Kong and Singapore. So let us dive right in.
Right, good afternoon. It's shortly after 5 p.m. Tokyo time. My name is Norbert Gecke. I'm the founder of Tokyo FinTech, which is a non-profit organization registered in Japan, aiming to help drive innovation in financial services. And I'm joined by two of my good friends here. We've all been to the Singapore Festival last week, and we thought it would be a great idea just to reconvene afterwards and exchange perspectives, because it is a massive event and we went in different directions. So this is our subjective recap of what we've seen. We don't claim to have the authority to judge in any way. We'll just share our perspectives and hopefully it's helpful to you. And if you actually have been in Singapore or you do have a question, the LinkedIn audio tool should give you the opportunity to raise your hand and we can bring you on either for your comment or your question. I'd like to introduce Nachi and Zach, or rather let them introduce themselves. And maybe while you do this, Nachi and Zach, share just the first thing that comes to mind, what impressed you most over the last week.
All right. Hi, everybody. Zach here. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Singapore FinTech Festival. This is my fourth time going. I went to the inaugural one in 2016, back in 2017, again in 2019, and then this year. You know, it's amazing to see how much it's scaled, how big it's gotten. It was 3 halls the first year, and this year it was all 6 halls at the Singapore Expo Center, which is massive. I think on day 2, just at the event, I clocked about 16,000 steps, going around, exploring, meeting, talking, checking out different work sessions, seminars, etc. The thing that stuck with me the most, actually, there's a lot of things that left impressions on me, but actually, I think for me, the most interesting thing was gentleman by the name of Balaji S. I think most of you guys have heard of him. He was the CTO at Coinbase, and he did a really, really interesting presentation on something I've been following of his called the network state, which is the idea of sort of building virtual sovereign states across traditional state borders and boundaries. So that was really, really interesting and great. It was very short, but so thus far, like the most detailed and interesting discussion about that. So the idea of what is the state, what are the identity requirements? You know, these are all things that sort of tie into sort of Web3 and DeFi and sovereignty. So very, very interesting stuff for me. Nachi, I'm going to pass the mic over to you and let you give yourself intro and tell the crowd what your first impressions were.
Sure. Thank you, Zach. This was an awesome event, but just a couple of lines about me. I'm from New York. I'm a Wall Street former investment banker who worked with the large firms like Lehman, Barclays, etc. For about 4 years ago, I quit the big banks and I've become an entrepreneur and investor. I'm based in Tokyo. I used to live in Tokyo before I moved back to New York, but I've been in Tokyo for the entire duration of the pandemic and will be here going forward. And I have ventures in FinTech and cybersecurity and other areas. So for me, it was quite personal. I, in fact, represented one of the ventures in this festival, which is a very interesting location, intelligence, and AI platform. The thing that impressed me the most about this festival was the sheer size, the magnitude of it. Like you were saying, Zach, it has grown tremendously over the past few years. Last year, all of us attended virtually. And this year, when I was in the plenary hall, the crowds were overwhelming. And then when you looked at all these stalls, the different kinds of participants, that was really mind-boggling. So the size was really something very striking, which bodes well for the entire region. And Singapore is swiftly becoming an important hub for FinTech. And quite appropriately, therefore, I'll mention 2 things and then we'll get into the conversation. The plenary talks were all fabulous, but I could not attend all of them live because I was meeting a lot of people. But Lawrence's keynote speech was very, very interesting, talking about where Singapore is going, what the themes were this year, which kind of sets the stage for a lot of participants, both public and private, to push the boundaries, talking about a fresh $150 million Singapore dollar commitment towards financial sector technology and innovation, where they bring in government and entrepreneurship together. They've been doing that successfully over the last few years, and they pick certain themes, and this year was no different. So that's something that struck me. The other thing that struck me, apart from the companies or ventures themselves, were the countries. I thought that this year the countries and regions were doing a very good job of representing themselves through both their booths, but as well as through some select ventures from those areas who would come in and meet people and try to establish businesses. I thought that was something remarkable and something that should be in line because it's a FinTech festival for the entire region. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Norbert.
Yeah, thank you. I think I can echo much of what you said. I found Lawrence Wong's speech very impressive as well. And maybe it's kind of the nature that we, like the politicians that don't govern our own country. So in conversation with some Singaporean friends throughout the week, I think they were maybe less impressed by their government overall, but I think the Deputy Prime Minister, they gave some due credit. So I think it was a clearly articulated vision and objectives for the country, which we don't hear that clearly from other folks. And I mean, clearly the world was coming together, and that's why we spent most time networking, I think, rather than listening to the speeches, which will be video recorded. In macro level, what I found a bit of shame, if you look at Asia and the Hong Kong Festival, Singapore Festival, they used to be in consecutive weeks. And this was all bundled in 1 week, I think Monday, Tuesday for Hong Kong, and then Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for Singapore. Some people actually managed to do both, but it can be very, very tight. I can only make sense of it just from the perspective that the decision to actually hold both of them came pretty late, and that's why the dates overlapped. With the end of the Singapore FinTech Festival, they announced the dates already for 2023. So I would hope that kind of the schedule gets a bit easier again. From an Asia perspective, competition certainly is healthy, but then Asia is also competition with anybody else, and we want to have as many people as possible experience Asia and not have to choose between two locations, really.
I agree, especially when you put this in a global context. The FinTech Festival in Singapore followed almost immediately after Money 2020, which is one of the biggest payment and FinTech conferences in the world. And we had our collaborators and business partners come directly from Vegas. If you want to create a similar impact, which Singapore can, because it's the only one of that size in the region, then it needs a little bit of breathing room so that people, especially from outside the region, can plan for it appropriately.
So with engagement of the governments, there were an abundance of announcements throughout the week, and it was really hard to keep track of. But from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, certainly 2 announcements bundled together that focused on central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. One was around what they call Project Orchid, which was phase 1. And the MAS has been very clear and reiterated it this week as well that currently they don't see a case for a retail CBDC. However, they've done some pilots, proof of concept, on what they refer to as purpose-bound money, or PBM. So actually, as part of the Singapore FinTech Festival, there was an experiment that handed 5,000 times 20 Singapore dollars as an NFT into your wallet, and you could spend it at merchants throughout. So got some vouchers, 1 Sing, 2 Sing, 5 Sing, 10 Sing. not just making policy, but actually putting it into action. So that was cool to see. Then they announced a successor to Project Ubin, which is now Ubin Plus. I'm waiting for Ubin Plus Plus in a few years, I guess. And it's really around wholesale CBDCs, which are coming, specifically focused on cross-border FX settlements using these wholesale CBDCs. So as part of that, there will be Project Marina, which goes together with the Banque de France, the Swiss National Banks, and the BRS Innovation Hubs, plus a SWIFT sandbox for CBDCs, which apparently has 17 central banks participating. So things keep moving in that regard. And that, for me, was a major announcement from the regulatory side, reiterating currently no plan for retail CBDC, but some purpose, programmable money, basically, and then progressing on the wholesale side. Zach, coming back to you overall in FinTech, what was hot for you? What were the business models that struck you?
I typically look at the FinTech Festival as a market bellwether, right? So like what's hot, what's coming, sort of forward looking. And from sort of that go-to-market perspective, for example, I'm looking at 4 years ago, how many crypto exchanges were there? I think at the time there was just a couple. 4 years ago, how many PSPs were there? Payment service providers, just a handful. And now what we're seeing, right, is a proliferation of exchanges and payment service providers, which I think is a great indicator of sort of where the market is going from I guess you'd call it a retail point of view. And so I think that where business is coalescing and where money is going is really, really interesting for me personally. Compared to when I first got started in FinTech, which was now almost a decade ago, just to see how deep and broad it goes was really impressive for me. I think ultimately, right, what we're still not seeing, to your point earlier about cross-border payments, I think there's still a lot of problem solving to be done in that space, and you can see a lot of novel solutions for it. There's still a lot to be done in cross-border transactions, even now, right? Everybody wants to get off of SWIFT and all of the traditional networks, but we still don't really have a clear solution for that. Sort of similarly to how we don't have a clear solution from my point of view anyway, about actually how to deliver the promise of crypto, more broadly speaking. Every year we get a little bit closer to that optimal state, but we're still like a little bit distant from cross-border, and liquidity are still huge challenges to solve. I don't know if that answers your question, Norbert.
It does, thank you. You were basically drawing a timeline saying we moved
Yes.
right over the years, and payments and crypto became much more established. And so
For sure.
we're looking kind of for the next wave of things now that we're in more maturity in payments and crypto. What's the smaller waves that's starting now that you would expect in 4 or 5 years to talk about in the same terms of maturity?
Actually, looking at payments and cryptos, I think a coalescence of those spaces is probably going to happen. The folks who have gone into sort of full stack cloud enablement of payments, payments as a service, some of them are now starting to offer payments in crypto compatibility, crypto native and crypto to fiat services. I think are probably the next sort of collision of those two spaces when we're talking about, how you move money and how you pay for things. Again, 6-7 years ago, if you wanted to do a payments business in a market, you could go to like episode 6 and you could get a cloud-based stack that could manage your acceptance processing and settlement. That was like, off the shelf, and you had to build a front end for it. And now you can just go buy that, as a service, like end to end. So that's a big change. And again, I think that going further and deeper into crypto, and even if whether that's going to be stable coins or central bank digital currencies or who knows, speculative coins like Bitcoin or Ethereum, I think that's coming, where you're going to step out of that sort of exclusive, sort of Coinbase type of crypto exchange world into more retail transactional landscape.
Zach, to echo your point, that was one of the themes that Lawrence also touched upon, is how do you proliferate the instant money transfer technologies across countries, right?
Yeah.
UPI has it in India, Brazil has it. It's free, it's bank account to bank account, it's instantaneous. You really, in this day and age, should not be having to pay fees for transferring money from one bank account to the other. And Singapore is now tying up with other nation networks, including UPI, of course, to enable that. So hopefully one friction point, one common and often used friction point of just moving money from one country to the other for personal or for business purposes, hopefully that friction goes away soon. This year, both Supnendu Mohanty and Ravi Menon of the MAS talked a lot about Web3, digital assets, and ESG related initiatives, which is good to hear. I mean, these are the emerging trends. The two foundational aspects that you touched upon, Zach, they need to be absolutely frictionless and robust. Otherwise, you're just adding more complexity to the superstructure. That's in my opinion. Unless you have a frictionless, seamless, efficient payment mechanism, and unless you have that cross-border, instantaneous, you're not going to be enabling digital assets exchange or valuation. That just becomes more difficult. Yeah, the other aspect which we can delve into this, hopefully, in this hour, is that the entire world is starved of credit, not just individuals, but even small businesses, and particularly in Asia. And when you think about the retail explosion here, the fierce competition among payment companies and brands for that same consuming population, there aren't enough credit opportunities. And that, I think, MAS could play a role in putting business and governments and regulators together.
I think that's a great point, actually. Access to credit, access to funds. What I did see, actually, back to the trends, for a lot of these marketplaces that are focused on providing services for SMEs, starting to see a lot more supply chain finance solutions. Now, I know that that's maybe market level or a little bit micro, platform level, but even that still, access to credit for small businesses when you have supply chain issues or downturns in the market, the fact that you could be providing a lifeline or helping businesses leap payment cycles, for example. It's kind of one of those promises that's been around for a while. And to your point about how you apply analytics to do that, I think a lot of that's appears to becoming more sophisticated. I mean, it has to be, right? But it's now starting to sort of pop up in the market, where I think 3 or 4 years ago, my colleagues and I used to walk around saying, like, where's all the supply chain finance? This year, I think we saw a lot more examples of that. And I think that's interesting, right? When you think about how you're going to build economies. I mean, obviously, like in Japan, right? I don't know the precise number, but it's like, what is it? 97% of businesses in Japan are SMEs, right? So the availability of credit to them to grow and expand and to feed the economy is critical if we want to continue, or if we want to have any growth at all.
It's a global problem with all the large economies. And Singapore, just because the MAS plays such a dominant role in guiding the conversation through their various government initiatives, I think they have got a great opportunity, and they do that in some themes, in bringing ventures, entrepreneurs, investors, government people, regulators together to address some of these issues. And I think this is also tied to location. An interesting and a very powerful vote of confidence for this year's festival was, I guess, the presence of Switzerland, right? I mean, they were in size, they were in quality, they were talking about their location, they're talking about their ventures. That's something obviously that Singapore can talk about, that Japan can talk about, whether it's, with its challenges, but also its attractions. And there was a Japan desk there as well, who we spoke with. So these are things I think that if following the festival, if we can have an opportunity to work with MAS, I think that can advance the conversation meaningfully. So that maybe, next year we might have some things to talk about in real development results.
Can I steer the conversation in a slightly different direction, Nachi? You just kind of you gave me a little burst of insight.
Sure, please.
I don't want to hijack because I think what you're raising is really valid and I think important. When you mentioned the country pavilions, right? So obviously when you have nationalities being represented, by trade organizations or what have you, that's, I think, really that's really awesome. It's a great validation of what we're trying to do. And obviously that's a sign that the world is all kind of aligned behind trying to find a way forward. And I'm gonna be like maybe a little bit critical for just a moment. And again, I found the Japan presence this year to be somewhat underwhelming. I've been in Japan for 25 years, so I guess I'm a member of Team Japan in a lot of ways. When I was working in fintech, we used to call ourselves the international face of Japanese fintech because Japan was so opaque to the rest of the world that people would always be very, very hungry for information that we could bring about what was happening in this market to other markets, whether that would be Hong Kong or Seoul, Singapore, Sydney. People always asked us like, "What's going on in Japan?" And I felt like I guess Jetro and Japan Trade didn't do like a spectacular job showing up like what the opportunities are in this market or what's coming out of this market that's going to be different and differentiated and adding value on a bigger stage.
I don't have much to add to what both of you mentioned, though the cities did come out and at least Fukuoka was doing a good job of attracting, but the style is not going to change overnight. So Japan needs to form some good partnerships and show some concrete proposals. That's the only way it'll change. But
I'll ask two questions of you guys. So one is AI broadly. It felt a bit that AI wasn't really a theme at the Singapore FinTech Festival. Maybe it's understood that AI is underlying some or many of the business models that we've seen, but it's actually felt a bit it has gotten into the background and the actual business use case has gone into the foreground. That was my impression. If that's the case, that's actually maybe a good thing, right? Because you don't do AI for AI's sake. You want to solve a specific business problem. What's your take on AI in the context of what you've seen during last week?
I think it was sadly missing. And I didn't think or I didn't see that AI was also represented in business cases. And that's why people didn't talk about it. And that really shocked me because last year, if you remember, the Singapore FinTech Festival made embedded finance a big theme. And people talked a lot about AI. Now, of course, AI is also an abused term. People just talk about any algorithm being AI. But last year, we discussed a lot about how AI-oriented analytics, especially in embedded finance, especially in any company, which is trying to rationalize its financial presence, makes a lot of sense. And come this year, I don't know, just because they thought of digital assets and Web 3.0, I really didn't see much of AI or AI-related ventures. I can be selfish and say, look, our venture was probably one of the very few that talked about how we are using AI for locational intelligence and retail and payment technology. I was hoping to see much more of that, especially around data and around individual services targeted towards individuals.
It definitely wasn't a star this time around. But to the point about not having AI for AI's sake, I think I did hear a lot of discussion about AI, ML, NLP as enablers for technology. So I don't think it was absent, but I think it's no longer a trendy theme. It's just become, I think, very present in the background as an enabler was my impression. Oh, we've got a hand that went up. I'd love to toss it to the audience instead of me sitting up here preaching.
Great to hear all of you speak on the Singapore event, and hello to my good friend Nachi. I'm currently based in Hong Kong, and I was just wondering how was the presence of Hong Kong in this event, and what was the general feeling of the current situation of Hong Kong vis-a-vis Singapore and the rivalry in terms of fintech leadership. So it'll be nice to hear your comments or take on that. Thanks.
Let's say 4 or 5 years ago, there was a time where a lot of businesses were looking to set up hubs or jumping off points in Asia, and there were a lot of beauty contests between Hong Kong and Singapore. Fast forward, and we've had, obviously there's China risk, there's social risk, and it seems to me, just as a guy who's sitting and talking about this from Tokyo, so take this with a grain of salt, please. Singapore has really emerged as a clear leader in the region in fintech and innovation in a way that I think Hong Kong just can't reach. if it's about accessing China, right, which has kind of been the Hong Kong, invest Hong Kong pitch for a long time now, access to the Pearl River Delta. I think there's still opportunities there, but the rest of Southeast Asia offers huge growth opportunities. And yeah, of course, there's going to be risks in every market. But I think we've seen some very, very evident risk, either whether the social movements in Hong Kong or it's zero COVID and supply chain issues coming out of China. China's a bit of a hot potato at the moment, would be my impression. And people were talking about how the momentum had really shifted quite clearly to Singapore. And I had several discussions around that. That was the impression that I got. Nachi, did you have a similar impression?
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of different strands. So I know this is also closer to home for DK because he lives in Hong Kong. See, over the past 3 years, there's been a clear migration of businesses, investors, and individuals from Hong Kong to Singapore. Singapore has also created new entities, VCC, for example, that makes it easier for ventures and investors. So that trend has continued, and you can see that. I did have a lot of my friends and business associates who still are not Hong Kong Chinese, who still live in Hong Kong, and they happen to live in Hong Kong. They transact business globally. They look at opportunities wherever they may be. And for them as well, there's no business in China right now. Think about, so where they're doing businesses? They're doing businesses in Singapore, Thailand, Japan, US, wherever they can be. Because everybody's transacting business everywhere. Hong Kong is still attractive from a finances perspective, taxes and the fees associated, that's still attractive. So people have continued to stay there. But one common theme is they can hop at any given time. That's not a very strong vote of confidence to establish a business out of Hong Kong. The other thing is, there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. If China is the bigger market and you continue to have a zero COVID policy, what does that do for a whole bunch of businesses targeting individuals? Personal finance, credit, travel, it's all up in the air. And 3 years is a long time. So investors get antsy, entrepreneurs get antsy. So we saw that. We saw manifestations of that at an individual level. And unfortunately, the timing of the Hong Kong festival and the Singapore one didn't help, right? If they were at least a few weeks apart, maybe we would have gotten some businesses and maybe there would have been slightly different people.
We'll just loop back to the ESG point that we started to capture.
I think I'll just end with the comment I started with, which is I don't get it. I don't get the emphasis on it. I mean, what I feel is that businesses are using ESG as quote unquote a differentiator. And it's a theme with big corporates. And in that regard, I feel like the festival this year, rather than being a bellwether and looking forward at, the relevant trends in FinTech in particular, I feel like it was actually it's a lagging indicator of what corporates care about more than what people in FinTech care about, was just kind of my initial impression. I mean, you could talk about how ESGs are going to, help people, help democratization, create new opportunities. And those things are some of the value that you offer through FinTech. But it really felt to me like an afterthought or like a corporate messaging thing more than an actually applied thing. And the ESG stages that I went to, a couple of those, and they varied so widely in their themes. And of course, ESG is very widely as well. But it just didn't feel like there was any theme to it or any consistency to it other than big corporate saying we do ESGs and we're great.
I'll give you a slightly different perspective from my angle. One of my ventures is centered around accurate carbon capture, using the blockchain ledgers to record it, providing transparency, and actually getting it certified from a third party so that whatever green you've used or not used is accurate. And we came up with that because we found a lot of misreporting, so-called greenwashing. And we came up with a lot of associated governance issues. So to some extent in this festival, in the ESG branch, let's say, there was talk of some initiatives around creating appropriate dictionaries, creating appropriate measures so that you could have you could begin to have a standardized language around governance, around reporting, and about verification, the G part of ESG, right? So that was what I saw. Far too little to your point, and not enough of an implication. I didn't focus on that venture of mine, so that didn't come out. But if it was a bigger play and if there was enough time, I think that's what would have helped. If you had a few ventures saying, look, we're doing X, Y, Z for this particular aspect of ESG, and this is how it's actually helping our stakeholders. That would have made it more interesting.
Yeah, for me, it was like a good opportunity to get to know a few companies in this space and what they actually focused on, because I have so far pretty much ignored ESG as a business opportunity or as looking at the startup ecosystem in that space. So just being able to stand at a booth and ask them, like, what is this reporting? What is scope 1, 2, 3? So I feel like I got my 101 education done there. And just kind of from a corporate perspective, HSBC took part in the Innovation Lab crawl. And as part of that, they had a pitch competition of 6 startups. So these were the finalists selected to essentially pitch for business with HSBC. And the competitors came from a wide range of areas. So it was from a bond marketplace to crypto risk management to kind of credit for SMEs, something we talked about as well earlier here. And the company that won was Kogo, which does kind of some of the accounting and reporting based out of New Zealand, and took it maybe more as an indication of where HSBC feels the pressure and maybe doesn't have an adequate solution. Then, because comparing these 6 startups that pitched is a bit like apple to oranges to whatever, blueberries and so on. They were very, very different. And so taking the fact that Kogo won was a bit like, okay, that's a need for HSBC. That's what I took away from that. The other things that I've learned, which came surprising to me, but probably is common knowledge for people in Singapore, is going to a presentation of UOB's digital bank tomorrow. And they were pretty open. So it was all, they said, like, not confidential information. They probably have given these speeches a few times already. But UOB built their digital bank onto a legacy core, which I found surprising given that you're going into Indonesia, into Thailand as the initial markets for that. And so presumably, if you use legacy technology, then you have a higher price point. So they were also saying that they're clearly not going at the lowest market segment in these markets, more at the higher end, and that rather than rebuilding the core, they spend lots of effort on cleaning the transaction data. So it's actually can generate actionable insights for the bank and for the customers, and they felt there was more value coming out of that. Contrast that with the Union Bank, Union Digital of the Philippines, where our Tokyo famous, at least if not regional famous, Peter Franken is the CTO. They also use the Singapore FinTech Festival to announce their milestones. So they launched 3 or 4 months ago. They've got like 1 million customers onboarded, and they use Thought Machine as the core, which is probably one of the most advanced engines that you can have. Now, in the initial rollout, they still have relatively plain vanilla products, but the Thought Machine engine gives them the capability, especially when you get into the lending space, to come up with products that are more sophisticated and kind of break down the barriers in the classic product silos that we have today. So I'm really curious to see what they are building with Union Digital in the future.
Yeah, I think that was a good, strong theme this year. And it goes to the point I was making earlier is that unless you have that core infrastructure in place, digital banking infrastructure, and seamless transfers, it's hard to build Web 3.0 and digital assets on top of it.
So we've got about 5 to 6 minutes left. It's almost final thoughts, takeaways. What are you going to do next type of question?
I want to hear what Nachi's going to do next because I'm going to follow him, whatever he does.
So, like I mentioned, Singapore FinTech Festival has been growing from strength to strength. It was great to come back to a physical event and to see the size of it. Everybody was present. I was joking to Norbert that the entire Singaporean population was present on the first day. It was great to see high-profile keynote speakers, both from business and the government. Senior management of ventures and banks were all there. And I'm sure we'd love to hear the recordings of those panel discussions. A lot of businesses from around the world, not just from the region, were there, which I like very much. What I would like for the festival to do are some really practical things. One is, as the festival has grown so big, it has also become very difficult to navigate. It was extremely difficult to find the people you want to meet because it's 3 days and it's a lot of people. You can't obviously do everything, so you want to select, and the apps and the selection criteria didn't work as efficiently as they should. So that's one area I would like to see the festival improve. Then the other is really to have more of these offsites or these interactive sessions, balance out the panel discussions and the plenary talks with a lot more of these interactive sessions, which makes it much more conducive for people to feel what FinTech is doing in their regular lives. I have a few ventures of my own, so I would have personally benefited if there were more interactions, not just among participants like us, which we did a fair amount, but also with some of these key leaders. That would have helped advance the conversation a lot more, in my opinion.
I think that's actually a great point, Nachi. Just to extend on that and build on that, what I think we are missing, there's so many sort of networking event, after party, swanky, go drink expensive booze in fancy bars kinds of events. And if you're a natural networker, or if you have, if you're already connected to people, maybe you can go to meet those people at those events. But I would have liked to see the festival take a more active hand in curation, both with timing, because there were, triple, quadruple booked on most evenings, but also, to your point, finding ways to make some of these wonderful, somewhat high profile members accessible to those of us who were visiting for the event. That would have been, I think, really the icing on the cake to add a dimension to what was, I think, overall a spectacular event. It's an insane amount of content, especially if you have any kind of sort of side meetings or that kind of thing. It becomes, scheduling yourself hour to hour or even 30-minute slots just to try to take it all in. So it's almost like it's its own worst enemy. It's achieved a level of scale that's almost unsustainable.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. I think we had a great conversation. So thank you very much for joining. Thanks to Nachi and Zach for sharing their thoughts over the last week, and hope to see you all soon again.
Thanks, Norbert, for putting this together. And Nachi, great to meet you as well.
Likewise, thank you very much, Norbert. Great meeting you, Zach. And we look forward to the next one.